In the bitter December of 1887, a young woman stepped off a train in Cedar Falls, Montana, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a voice that had been silent for 3 months. Rose Mitchell had once filled entire church sanctuaries with melodies so pure they could make grown men weep. But on that frozen platform, surrounded by swirling snow and the echo of her own shattered dreams, she couldn't even whisper her own name when the station master asked who had come to collect her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rose Mitchell had been the pride of Springfield, Missouri's First Methodist Church. Every Sunday morning, her soprano voice would rise above the congregation like morning mist over the Missouri River, carrying hymns that seemed to lift the very roof beams toward heaven. The church ladies would nudge each other and whisper about how Rose could sing the angels right down from their clouds, and even the most hardened farmers would find themselves dabbing at their eyes during her renditions of Amazing Grace. She was 23 years old, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and eyes the color of spring leaves. Rose had inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's stubborn chin, though most folks in Springfield knew her, more for the voice that could make a lullaby sound like a prayer and a prayer sound like pure magic. She worked as a seamstress in her aunt's dress shop, but everyone knew that Rose's real calling was music. The church organist, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, had been after Rose for years to consider traveling to St. Louis to audition for the opera and house. But Rose had always been too shy, too content with her simple life in Springfield. That contentment began to crack the summer her aunt fell ill. The dress shop struggled, and Rose found herself working longer hours for less pay, watching her savings dwindle like water through a sieve. Her aunt's medical bills mounted, and the small inheritance from her parents had long since been spent on medicines and doctors who could do little more than shake their heads sympathetically. Rose began to feel the walls of her small world closing in, and for the first time in her life, her evening prayers carried more desperation than gratitude. It was during one of these difficult nights that Rose discovered the letter tucked between the pages of her hymnal. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, and the handwriting was careful and educated. Thomas Whitmore, a cattle rancher from Cedar Falls, Montana, had written to her after hearing about her situation from a mutual acquaintance. He described himself as a God-fearing man of 35 who owned a prosperous ranch and was seeking a wife to share his life and help him build a family. His words were respectful and kind, speaking of long winter evenings by the fire, Sunday services in the small chapel, and the beauty of Montana's endless skies. What caught Rose's attention most was a particular line in his letter. "I have heard tell of your beautiful voice, and I confess that the thought of having music in my home again fills me with more hope than I have felt in years." Thomas went on to explain that his mother had been a singer before she passed, and that the ranch house had been too quiet for too long. He promised that Rose would want for nothing, that she would have her own piano, and that he would be honored to have her sing at their wedding ceremony. Rose read the letter 17 times before she finally penned her response. She told Thomas about her aunt's illness, her financial struggles, and her dreams of using her voice to bring joy to others. She was honest about her lack of cooking skills beyond basic meals and her tendency to lose track of time when she was sewing. But she also wrote about her faith, her hope for a family of her own, and how the idea of bringing music to the Montana wilderness stirred something deep in her heart. Their correspondence continued for 3 months. Thomas's letters painted pictures of a life that seemed too good to be true. He described the ranch house with its wide front porch and the room he was preparing especially for her, complete with windows facing east so she could watch the sunrise while she practiced her scales. He wrote about the neighbors who would welcome her with open arms and the small but devoted congregation at Cedar Falls Community Chapel, who would be blessed to have her voice join their humble choir. Rose began to dream of Montana, of vast skies and clean air, of a husband who would cherish her gift and encourage her to share it with the world. She started saving every penny she could, selling her mother's jewelry and her father's books, anything that might help her scrape together the money for a train ticket west. Her aunt, despite her illness, encouraged Rose to pursue this chance at happiness, insisting that she could manage the dress shop with help from the church ladies. The decision to leave Springfield wasn't easy, but it felt inevitable, like a river flowing toward the sea. Rose packed her most precious possessions, her mother's sheet music, her father's Bible, and the blue silk dress she had made for special occasions. She wrapped everything carefully in her grandmother's quilt and said goodbye to the only life she had ever known. The train journey to Montana took 4 days, and with each mile that passed beneath the wheels, Rose felt herself changing. She wasn't just leaving Missouri. She was leaving behind the girl who had been content to sing in a small church for people who had known her since childhood. She was becoming someone new, someone brave enough to cross half the continent for love and the promise of a larger purpose. During the long hours of travel, Rose practiced her scales quietly, humming melodies that seemed to match the rhythm of the rails. She planned the songs she would sing at her wedding, the hymns she would offer to her new church, and the lullabies she would someday croon to her children. The other passengers began to gather around her seat in the evenings, drawn by the soft melodies that seemed to make the hard benches more comfortable and the stale air more bearable. An elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, traveling to visit her son in Billings, told Rose that she had the voice of an angel. A young soldier returning from duty in the Dakota Territory said her singing reminded him of his mother's voice and asked if she knew "The Water is Wide." Rose found herself performing impromptu concerts in the train car, her voice carrying stories of home and hope to fellow travelers who were all searching for something better in the vast American West. By the time the train began its final approach to Cedar Falls, Rose felt more confident than she had in months. She had seen the effect her voice had on strangers, had witnessed grown men weep at her rendition of Shenandoah, and watched homesick travelers find comfort in familiar melodies. She began to believe that perhaps Thomas was right, that Montana needed her music, that she could make a real difference in the lives of people who lived so far from the cultural centers of the East. The train pulled into Cedar Falls just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that took Rose's breath away. She had never seen anything so beautiful, so vast and wild and full of promise. The small station was little more than a wooden platform and a modest building, but to Rose, it looked like the threshold to a new world. She stepped off the train, with her heart hammering against her ribs, her satchel clutched tightly in her gloved hands. The platform was nearly empty, except for a few other passengers and a tall man in a dark coat who stood near the station house. Rose smoothed her traveling dress and approached him with what she hoped was a confident smile. Thomas Whitmore was not quite what she had expected. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders and hands that spoke of hard work, but his face was harder than his letters had suggested. His eyes, which she had pictured as warm and welcoming, were cold and calculating as they took in her appearance from head to toe. He didn't smile when she introduced herself, didn't offer to take her satchel or help her down from the platform. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Miss Mitchell, I trust your journey was acceptable." His voice was flat, businesslike, nothing like the warmth she had felt in his letters. Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter, but she pushed her doubts aside and smiled brighter, determined to make the best of this awkward beginning. Thomas led her to a wagon without offering his arm, and as they rode through the darkening streets of Cedar Falls, Rose tried to make conversation. She commented on the beautiful mountains, the crisp air, the cozy lights beginning to twinkle in the windows of the houses they passed. Thomas responded with grunts and one-word answers, his attention focused on the road ahead. The ranch house was exactly as Thomas had described it in his letters. A two-story structure with a wide front porch and windows that would indeed catch the morning sun. But as Rose stepped inside, she noticed immediately that there was no piano in the parlor, no music room with east-facing windows. The house was well appointed, but cold, and every surface was covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested it had been empty for some time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas showed her to her room, a small chamber at the back of the house with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto the barn. It was nothing like the comfortable suite he had described in his letters, but Rose told herself that perhaps there had been some misunderstanding, that once they were married, she would have free run of the house. That night, Rose lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind howl across the prairie and trying to calm her racing thoughts. She hummed softly to herself, a habit she had developed as a child to ward off fears and loneliness. The melody of "Be Thou My Vision" seemed to fill the small room with warmth, and Rose began to feel more hopeful. Tomorrow, she told herself, things would be different. Tomorrow, Thomas would be more welcoming, more like the man who had written those beautiful letters. But tomorrow brought only more coldness, more distance, more of Thomas's calculating stares. At breakfast, he barely acknowledged her presence, reading his newspaper while she ate in silence. When she asked about the piano he had mentioned, he looked at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "Piano," he said, his voice flat. "I never mentioned a piano." Rose felt her heart sink, but she forced herself to smile. "In your letters you wrote about music, about how much you missed having songs in your home." Thomas folded his newspaper with sharp, deliberate movements. "I think you may have misunderstood my intentions, Miss Mitchell. I wrote about many things. That doesn't mean I promised them." The conversation continued in this vein for several more uncomfortable minutes, with Thomas deflecting every reference Rose made to his letters and the promises contained within them. It was as if he had become a completely different person overnight, or perhaps as if the man who had written those letters had never existed at all. Rose spent the morning exploring the ranch, hoping to find some trace of the warmth and welcome she had expected. The property was indeed prosperous, with well-maintained buildings and healthy livestock, but there was something sterile about it all, something that spoke of function without joy. She found herself humming as she walked, her voice carrying across the empty fields like a prayer for understanding. It was during her exploration that she discovered the truth about Thomas Whitmore's correspondence. In the barn, she found a stack of letters in a wooden crate, and her heart nearly stopped when she recognized the handwriting. But these weren't Thomas's letters to her. They were drafts, practice versions written in a different hand, and at the bottom of each page was a signature she didn't recognize. The real author of the letters was someone named Jake Morrison, and attached to the drafts was a note in Thomas's unmistakable scrawl. "Use these, but change the details. Make sure she comes. I need a wife who can work, not one who expects to. Be entertained." Rose's hands trembled as she read through the evidence of Thomas's deception. The beautiful letters that had convinced her to leave everything behind, the promises of music and joy and partnership, all of it had been lies, carefully crafted to lure her to Montana under false pretenses. She felt physically sick as she realized the extent of his manipulation, the way he had used her own dreams and desires against her. That evening, Thomas called Rose into his study. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, and his face was cast in shadows that made him look more like a stranger than ever. He sat behind his desk like a judge, preparing to deliver a verdict, and Rose stood before him with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice colder than the Montana wind, "I think it's time we discussed your situation here." He leaned back in his chair and studied her with those calculating eyes. "You're not quite what I expected when I sent for you." Rose's throat felt tight, but she managed to speak. "I don't understand, Mr. Whitmore. I've tried to be everything you said you wanted in your letters." Thomas's laugh was harsh and bitter. "My letters were perhaps overly optimistic about what I was looking for. I needed a wife who could work, who could help me run this ranch and bear me children. I didn't need a delicate flower who thinks she's going to spend her days singing and playing piano." The words hit Rose like physical blows. She felt her face burn with shame and anger, but beneath those emotions was something deeper and more devastating, the realization that her voice, her greatest gift, was being dismissed as worthless by the man she had traveled across the country to marry. "I can work," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can learn to cook and clean and help with the ranch. But I'm also a singer, Mr. Whitmore. That's part of who I am." Thomas stood up from his desk and walked around to where Rose stood trembling. He looked down at her with contempt that made her feel smaller than she had ever felt in her life. "Let me be clear, Miss Mitchell. I don't want a singer. I want a wife who knows her place, who understands that her job is to take care of her husband and his home. If you can't accept that, then perhaps you should consider other arrangements." Rose felt something break inside her chest, something that had nothing to do with her heart and everything to do with her spirit. The music that had always lived just beneath her skin, ready to burst forth at any moment, suddenly felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of Thomas's rejection. "Other arrangements?" she managed to ask. Thomas returned to his desk and pulled out a small stack of bills. "I'll give you enough money to get back to Missouri, assuming you understand that our engagement is terminated. I had hoped you would be more suitable, but I can see that we are not well matched." Rose stared at the money in his outstretched hand, and for a moment she almost took it. The idea of returning to Springfield, of admitting failure to everyone who had wished her well, was almost unbearable. But the alternative, staying here with a man who had lied to her, who saw her greatest gift as a liability, was worse. "I'll need time to consider," she said finally. Thomas shrugged. "Take all the time you need, but understand that if you stay, things will be on my terms. No piano, no singing, no foolish dreams about entertaining the neighbors. Just work, and lots of it." Rose left the study, feeling as if she were walking through a nightmare. The man who had written those beautiful letters about music and partnership had never existed. In his place was someone who saw her as nothing more than free labor, someone who wanted to strip away everything that made her who she was. That night, Rose tried to sing. She opened her mouth, took a deep breath, and attempted to hum the melody of Amazing Grace, the hymn that had always brought her comfort. But nothing came out except a harsh whisper, a sound so broken and painful that it made her weep. For the first time in her life, Rose Mitchell's voice was gone. Rose woke the next morning to the sound of Thomas's boots stomping across the wooden floors downstairs. The harsh reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. She dressed slowly in the dim morning, light, her fingers trembling as she buttoned her simple gray dress. When she tried to hum while brushing her hair, the same painful whisper emerged from her throat, and she pressed her lips together in defeat. Downstairs, Thomas was already finishing his breakfast, his newspaper spread before him like a wall between them. He didn't look up when Rose entered the kitchen, didn't acknowledge her presence until she cleared her throat softly. "I've decided," To return to Missouri, she said, her voice barely audible. Thomas folded his paper with deliberate precision and finally met her eyes. Smart choice. The afternoon train heads east. I'll have Jake drive you to the station. The casual dismissal in his tone made Rose's chest tighten. This man had spent months crafting letters designed to make her fall in love with a fiction, had convinced her to uproot her entire life, and now he was discarding her like yesterday's newspaper. She wanted to tell him exactly what she thought of his deception, wanted to demand an explanation for his cruelty, but the words wouldn't come. Her voice had abandoned her just when she needed it most. Rose spent the morning packing her few belongings back into the worn leather satchel. Each item felt heavier than it had when she'd packed it in Springfield, weighted down with the crushing disappointment of her shattered dreams. Her mother's sheet music, once a source of joy and possibility, now seemed like relics of a life she could never reclaim. She folded her blue silk dress with particular care, knowing she might never have occasion to wear it again. Jake Morrison arrived in the early afternoon, driving the same wagon that had brought Rose from the station just 2 days earlier. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes that seemed apologetic, though he never spoke of his role in Thomas's deception. As they rode through Cedar Falls toward the train station, Rose caught glimpses of the life she might have had in this small Montana town. Children played in snow-covered yards, while their mothers hung laundry on lines that snapped in the crisp winter air. Smoke curled from brick chimneys, carrying the scent of wood fires and home-cooked meals. The train station was busier in the afternoon, with travelers heading east towards civilized cities and familiar comforts. Rose stood on the platform with her satchel at her feet, watching other passengers board the eastbound train with purpose and determination. She envied them, their certainty, their clear destinations and confident strides. When the conductor called for final boarding, Rose reached for her satchel and felt something inside her chest crack open like a frozen pond in spring. She couldn't do it. She couldn't climb aboard that train and return to Springfield as the failed mail-order bride who had been found wanting. She couldn't face her aunt's sympathetic eyes or the church lady's whispered conversations, or the slow, suffocating return to a life that had already proven too small for her dreams. As the train pulled away from the station, with a great hiss of steam and grinding of wheels, Rose remained on the platform, her satchel still at her feet, watching her last easy escape disappear into the Montana wilderness. The other passengers scattered to their waiting families and warm homes, leaving Rose alone in the gathering dusk with nowhere to go and no voice to call for help. She wandered through the streets of Cedar Falls like a ghost, her footsteps echoing off the wooden sidewalks. The town was smaller than Springfield, with perhaps 200 residents and only a handful of businesses lining Main Street. There was Henderson's General Store, Green's Bakery, Dr. Clark's medical office, and at the far end of the street, a modest white building with a simple wooden cross mounted above its door. The sight of the chapel made Rose's throat tighten with longing for the church back home, for the community and purpose she had left behind. As darkness began to fall, Rose found herself standing outside Henderson's General Store, studying the handwritten notice in the window advertising a room for rent above the shop. The idea of spending what little money she had on lodging felt reckless, but the alternative was sleeping in the street or swallowing her pride and returning to Thomas's ranch. She pushed open the door and heard the familiar chime of a bell announcing her arrival. Harold Henderson was a portly man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and flour dusting his apron. He looked up from his ledger when Rose approached the counter, his expression curious but not unkind. "Help you with something, miss?" Rose opened her mouth to speak and felt her voice catch. She cleared her throat and tried again, managing only a hoarse whisper. The room upstairs, is it still available? Henderson squinted at her through his spectacles. You feeling poorly? Sound like you might be coming down with something. Rose shook her head, unable to explain that her voice had simply vanished along with her dreams. Henderson seemed to accept her silence as shyness and quoted her a weekly rate that would consume most of her remaining money. Rose nodded and counted out the bills with shaking fingers, grateful that he didn't ask questions about why a young woman was seeking lodging alone in Cedar Falls. The room above the general store was small and spartanly furnished, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over Main Street. It smelled of dust and disuse, but it was clean and private, and for now it was hers. Rose sat on the edge of the bed and tried once more to produce some sound, some melody, anything that might prove her voice wasn't gone forever. But only silence emerged, a silence so complete it seemed to echo in the small room. For 3 days, Rose barely left her room, except to use the privy behind the building and to purchase basic necessities from Henderson downstairs. She ate sparingly, trying to make her money last as long as possible while she figured out what to do next. The sound of life in Cedar Falls drifted up through her floorboards. Customers chatting with Henderson, children playing in the street, the distant sound of hammering from the blacksmith shop. But Rose felt separated from it all by the wall of her silence. On the 4th morning, hunger finally drove her downstairs to the general store's modest selection of food items. Henderson was arranging canned goods on his shelves when she approached, and he greeted her with the same gentle curiosity he'd shown before. Voice still giving you trouble? He asked. Rose nodded, pointing to her throat apologetically. Henderson set down his stack of cans and studied her with concern. Might want to see Doc Clark about that. He's got some experience with throat ailments. But if money's tight, Martha Green over at the bakery makes a honey and lemon concoction. That's helped folks before. The mention of money made Rose's cheeks burn with embarrassment. Henderson had clearly noticed her careful purchasing habits, the way she counted every coin before making even the smallest purchase. She was grateful for his kindness, but the reminder of her precarious financial situation made her stomach clench with anxiety. After purchasing a small loaf of bread and a tin of preserves, Rose ventured outside for the first time since arriving in town. The December air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke. She walked slowly down Main Street, observing the rhythms of small-town life that continued around her like a dance she couldn't join. Green's Bakery occupied a corner building with large windows that revealed the warm interior beyond. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls wafted onto the street, making Rose's empty stomach growl audibly. Through the windows, she could see a woman with graying hair and flour-dusted hands arranging pastries in a display case. Rose hesitated outside the bakery for several minutes, gathering the courage to enter. When she finally pushed open the door, a bell tinkled cheerfully overhead, and the woman behind the counter looked up with a welcoming smile. "Good morning. I don't think we've met. I'm Martha Green." Rose approached the counter and opened her mouth to introduce herself, but only managed a whispered croak. Martha's expression immediately shifted to one of concern. "Oh, honey, you sound terrible. Sore throat?" Rose nodded gratefully, relieved not to have to explain the complex truth of her situation. Martha bustled around the counter and guided Rose to a small table near the window. "You sit right there, and I'll fix you something that'll help. Harold Henderson mentioned you might be by, said you're staying in his upstairs room." While Martha prepared whatever remedy she had in mind, Rose looked around the cozy bakery. The walls were decorated with cheerful yellow paint and lined with shelves displaying Martha's baked goods. A few small tables were scattered around the room, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated warmth that seemed to seep into Rose's bones. Martha returned with a steaming mug that smelled of honey and herbs. "Drink this slowly. It's my grandmother's recipe for throat troubles. Honey, lemon, ginger, and a few other things I won't tell you about unless it works." The liquid was warm and soothing, coating Rose's abused throat with sweetness. For a moment, she almost believed it might restore her voice, might undo the damage that Thomas's rejection had inflicted. But when she tried to thank Martha, only another whisper emerged. "Don't try to talk just yet," Martha said, settling into the chair across from Rose. "Sometimes the best thing for a troubled throat is rest. I'm guessing you haven't been doing much of that lately." Martha's assumption was more accurate than she knew. Rose hadn't truly rested since arriving in Cedar Falls, had barely slept for the anxiety and heartbreak that churned in her chest like a winter storm. She sipped Martha's remedy and felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "You know," Martha continued, "I could use some help around here during the winter months. Business picks up some with folks wanting warm bread and pastries, but I'm not as young as I used to be. If you're looking for work, I might be able to offer a few hours here and there. Nothing fancy, just helping with customers. Maybe some light cleaning." Rose's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness. She nodded eagerly, trying to convey her gratitude through expression alone. Martha patted her hand gently. "Good. We'll start slow. See how you feel. And don't worry about the talking. Plenty of work can be done in comfortable silence." Over the next several days, Rose fell into a routine that gradually began to feel like the foundation of a new life. She would wake early in her small room, above Henderson's store, dress carefully in one of her 2 remaining decent dresses, and walk the short distance to Green's Bakery. Martha had been true to her word about comfortable silence, never pressuring Rose to speak or explain her circumstances. Rose proved to be a capable assistant, her seamstress training having given her steady hands and attention to detail that served her well in arranging displays and handling delicate pastries. She swept floors, wiped down tables, and helped customers by pointing to items and writing prices on small slips of paper. Most of the townspeople seemed to accept her silence as a temporary ailment, though she caught the occasional curious glance or whispered comment. Martha paid Rose a modest daily wage that helped stretch her remaining money, and she often sent Rose home with day-old bread or leftover pastries. It wasn't much, but it was honest work that gave Rose's days structure and purpose. More importantly, it connected her to the community in a way that felt safe and undemanding. It was during her second week at the bakery that Rose first encountered Samuel Hayes. She was arranging fresh dinner rolls in the front window when the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see a tall man in dark clothing removing his hat as he entered. He had gentle brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of quiet thoughtfulness that reminded Rose of her father. "Good morning, Martha," he said, his voice warm but subdued. "The usual order for Sunday service?" Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course, Samuel. Rose, this is Reverend Hayes from the chapel. Samuel, this is Rose Mitchell. She's been helping me out here." Samuel nodded politely in Rose's direction, and she offered a small smile in return. When he didn't seem to expect a verbal greeting, Rose felt a wave of relief. So many people had tried to draw her into conversation over the past weeks, their good intentions making her silence feel like a failure. "Martha tells me you make the finest communion bread this side of the Rockies," Samuel said, returning his attention to the baker. Martha blushed with pleasure. "Flattery will get you an extra loaf, Reverend. How are you managing over at the chapel? I know this time of year can be difficult." Something flickered across Samuel's face, a shadow of pain that was quickly smoothed away. "We're managing well enough. The congregation has been very supportive." Rose found herself studying Samuel's profile as he and Martha discussed his order. There was something in his bearing that spoke of recent sorrow. a careful way he held himself that reminded Rose of her own fragile state. When he thanked Martha and prepared to leave, his eyes met Rose's briefly, and she saw a recognition there, as if he understood something about silence and loss that others might not. After Samuel left, Martha began packaging his order with particular care. "Poor man," she said softly. "Lost his wife Emily about 2 years ago. Consumption took her, and it nearly broke him. He's a good preacher, kind to everyone, but you can see he's still carrying that grief." Rose felt a pang of sympathy for the quiet reverend. She understood something about carrying invisible wounds, about the way loss could steal your voice and leave you fumbling for meaning in a world that suddenly seemed too large and too empty. That Sunday, Rose found herself walking past the chapel during service time. She hadn't intended to attend, hadn't set foot in a church since arriving in Cedar Falls, but something drew her to the modest white building. Through the open door, she could hear Samuel's voice reading from scripture, his tone gentle and measured. Rose stood outside in the cold December air, listening to the familiar cadences of worship. When the congregation began to sing "Holy, Holy, Holy," Rose's throat tightened with longing. She had sung that hymn hundreds of times, her voice soaring above the congregation in Springfield's Methodist Church. Now she could only listen as other voices carried the melody she had once claimed as her own. As the service ended and parishioners began to file out, Rose turned to leave before anyone could notice her hovering outside. But Samuel's voice stopped her. "Miss Mitchell?" Rose turned back to find the Reverend standing in the chapel doorway, his coat draped over his arm. The last of his congregation was dispersing into the bright winter morning, their conversations and laughter fading as they walked toward their homes and Sunday dinners. "I hope you don't mind my asking," Samuel said, stepping closer, "but are you quite well? Martha mentioned you've been having some trouble with your voice." Rose nodded, touching her throat self-consciously. Samuel's expression was kind but concerned, without the curiosity that had made other inquiries feel intrusive. "I don't mean to pry," he continued. "It's just that sometimes when we're carrying heavy burdens, they can manifest in physical ways. If you ever need someone to listen, even if listening is all that's required, my door is always open." Something in his tone made Rose believe he truly understood about heavy burdens and their physical manifestations. She managed a grateful smile and a small nod before hurrying away, but Samuel's words stayed with her as she walked back to her small room above Henderson's store. That evening, Rose sat by her window, watching the lights come on in houses throughout Cedar Falls. Families were gathering for Sunday supper, sharing their days and their hopes for the week ahead. The scene filled Rose with a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache, but for the first time since arriving in Montana, she also felt something else, a tiny spark of possibility. Martha had given her work and dignity. Samuel had offered understanding without judgment. Perhaps Cedar Falls could become more than just a place where her dreams had died. Perhaps it could become the place where she learned to dream again. The next morning brought news that would test Rose's newfound sense of stability. Harold Henderson was waiting for her when she came downstairs, his expression grave. "Miss Mitchell, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. My wife's sister back in Denver has taken ill, and we need to travel there immediately. I'll have to close the store for several weeks, maybe longer." Rose felt her stomach drop. Without her small room above the store, she had nowhere to live. Her savings, even supplemented by her work at the bakery, wouldn't cover lodging at the town's single boarding house for more than a few days. Henderson seemed to understand her predicament. "I've spoken with a few folks in town, and Martha Green has offered to let you stay in her spare room while we're away. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." Rose's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Martha's kindness seemed to know no bounds, and the thought of having a place to stay during this crisis felt like a miracle. That afternoon, Rose moved her few possessions to Martha's small house behind the bakery. The spare room was tiny but comfortable, with a window that looked out over Martha's kitchen garden and the chapel beyond. Martha refused to accept any payment for the lodging, insisting that the help Rose provided at the bakery was compensation enough. "Besides," Martha said, as she helped Rose arrange her belongings, "it'll be nice to have some company. This house gets awfully quiet, especially in the winter." As Rose settled into her new temporary home, she began to feel something she hadn't experienced since leaving Springfield: a sense of belonging. Martha treated her like family, including her in evening meals and quiet conversations by the fire. Though Rose still couldn't speak above a whisper, Martha seemed content to carry most of their conversations, sharing stories about Cedar Falls' history and the various characters who called the town home. It was during one of these fireside chats that Martha mentioned something that made Rose's heart skip. "You know," Martha said, poking at the logs in her fireplace, "Samuel used to tell me that Emily had the most beautiful singing voice. Said she could make the angels weep with her hymns. He's mentioned more than once how much he misses having music at the chapel. The congregation does their best, but they could use someone to help lead them, especially during the Christmas season." Martha glanced at Rose meaningfully. "I know you're having trouble with your voice right now, but when it comes back, and I'm sure it will, you might consider joining the choir. Might be good for both you and Samuel." Rose touched her throat, automatically remembering the way her voice had once filled sacred spaces with joy and worship. The idea of singing again, of using her gift to serve others as she had in Springfield, filled her with both longing and terror. What if her voice never returned? What if the damage Thomas had inflicted was permanent? But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind whistle through Martha's garden and watching the chapel's simple cross silhouetted against the starlit sky, Rose allowed herself to imagine standing before that small congregation, her voice raised in praise and thanksgiving. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, she dared to hope that her greatest gift might not be lost forever. The first snow of December fell like a blessing over Cedar Falls, transforming the rough edges of the frontier town into something magical and soft. Rose stood at Martha's kitchen window, watching the flakes dance in the lamplight from the chapel across the way. For 3 weeks now, she had lived in Martha's spare room, and slowly, carefully, she'd begun to weave herself into the fabric of this small community. Her voice remained stubbornly absent, emerging only as whispers and croaks when she attempted to speak. But Rose had discovered that silence could be its own form of communication. The townspeople had grown accustomed to her gentle nods, her expressive eyes, and the way she could convey volumes with a simple gesture. At the bakery, regular customers would point to their usual orders, while Rose smiled and prepared their purchases with practiced efficiency. Dr. Benjamin Clark had examined her throat twice at Martha's insistence, his weathered hands gentle, as he pressed against her neck and peered down her throat with his small mirror. Each time, he proclaimed her vocal cords healthy and unmarked, suggesting that her condition was more of the spirit than the body. His words offered both hope and frustration. If nothing was physically wrong, why couldn't she simply will her voice to return? The answer came to Rose during one of her evening walks through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. She had developed a habit of walking after supper, needing the cold air and solitude to process the strange new shape her life had taken. On this particular evening, her steps led her past the chapel just as Samuel was extinguishing the oil lamps inside. He emerged from the building as she approached, pulling on his heavy winter coat. When he noticed her, his face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Miss Mitchell, out for an evening constitutional?" Rose nodded, then impulsively pointed toward the chapel. Samuel's expression grew thoughtful as he seemed to understand her unspoken question. "Would you like to see inside? I was just finishing up, but I have a few more minutes." The chapel's interior was simple and peaceful, with wooden pews arranged in neat rows facing a modest altar. A small pump organ sat to one side, its keys yellowed with age but well maintained. The walls were bare, except for a simple wooden cross and two stained glass windows that would catch the morning light beautifully. Despite its humble appearance, the space radiated the same sense of sanctuary that Rose remembered from her childhood: church. Samuel moved through the space with obvious affection, straightening hymnals and adjusting the altar cloth with careful attention. "It's not much compared to the grand churches back east," he said, "but it serves our needs well enough. Emily used to say that God cares more about the hearts gathered in worship than the grandeur of the building." At the mention of his late wife, Samuel's voice took on a wistful quality that made Rose's chest tighten with sympathy. She had learned more about Emily Hayes from Martha's gentle gossip over the past weeks. Emily had been beloved in Cedar Falls, known for her kindness to the sick and her beautiful singing voice that had led the chapel choir for nearly 5 years. Her death from consumption had left not only Samuel bereft, but the entire congregation without their musical foundation. Rose found herself drawn to the old pump organ, her fingers hovering over the keys without quite touching them. Samuel noticed her interest and moved to stand beside her. "Do you play?" he asked softly. Rose nodded, then touched her throat apologetically. Samuel's understanding was immediate and complete. "Ah, you're a musician. That explains something I've been wondering about." Rose looked at him questioningly, and Samuel's cheeks colored slightly. "I hope you don't think me presumptuous, but I've noticed how you listen during our services. Even standing outside, you seem to know exactly when the hymns begin and end. And the way you hold yourself during the music, it's the posture of someone who knows song from the inside out." Rose felt tears prick at her eyes. Samuel had seen something in her that she had thought was lost forever, had recognized the musician beneath the silence. She nodded again, more vigorously this time, and Samuel's smile was warm with understanding. "Emily used to say that music was just prayer with wings," he said quietly. "She believed that every voice raised in song was a gift to God, no matter how simple or grand. I've missed that perspective since she's been gone." Without quite realizing what she was doing, Rose pressed one of the organ keys. The note rang out clear and true in the quiet chapel, and Samuel's breath caught audibly. Encouraged, Rose pressed another key, then another, until she was picking out the melody of Amazing Grace with hesitant fingers. The music filled the small space like incense, and Rose felt something shift inside her chest, not her voice. That remained frustratingly silent, but something deeper. A recognition that music could exist beyond the human voice. That melody could be prayer, even when it came from worn wooden keys and wheezing bellows. Samuel stood perfectly still beside her, his eyes closed and his face peaceful. When Rose finished the hymn, the silence that followed felt sacred rather than empty. "Thank you," he whispered. "I hadn't realized how much I missed hearing that." Song played with real feeling. Rose's throat worked as she tried to respond, but only the familiar rasp emerged. Samuel seemed to understand without words. "Would you consider playing for our services just until your voice returns, of course? The congregation has been managing without music for so long that even simple accompaniment would be a tremendous gift." Rose's heart raced with a mixture of longing and terror. To play for worship again, to be part of a community of faith rather than just an observer. The idea filled her with hope. But what if she wasn't good enough? What if her playing, like her voice, had been damaged by Thomas's rejection? Samuel seemed to sense her hesitation. There's no pressure, of course. Take all the time you need to consider it, but I want you to know that whatever you might offer would be received with gratitude." That night, Rose lay awake in Martha's spare room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Samuel's invitation. Through her small window, she could see the chapel's cross silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and she found herself remembering all the Sunday mornings in Springfield, when her voice had soared above the congregation like a bird taking flight. The next morning brought news that would change the dynamic of Rose's carefully constructed new life. Martha burst into the bakery where Rose was arranging fresh bread, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Rose, dear, you'll never guess what I just heard from Mrs. Patterson. Thomas Whitmore is getting married." Rose felt her blood turn to ice water. The bread roll she was holding tumbled from her numb fingers and rolled across the floor. Martha continued, seemingly unaware of Rose's shock. "Can you imagine? Just 3 weeks after sending you away, he's found himself another mail-order bride, a young woman from Kansas, apparently. The wedding is planned for this Saturday at his ranch." The betrayal cut deeper than Rose had expected. She had known that Thomas was capable of deception and cruelty, but the speed with which he had replaced her felt like another rejection, another confirmation that she was somehow fundamentally inadequate. Martha's next words made the situation even worse. "The whole town is talking about it. Some folks are saying terrible things about you, suggesting that there must have been something seriously wrong for Thomas to send you away so quickly and find someone else. I told them all to mind their own business, but you know how people can be." Rose sank into one of the bakery's chairs, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She had thought she was beginning to find acceptance in Cedar Falls, but now it seemed that her failure with Thomas was being dissected and judged by the entire community. The whispers and sideways glances she had attributed to curiosity about her silence took on a new, more sinister meaning. Martha immediately regretted her tactless delivery of the news. She knelt beside Rose's chair and took her hands. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have blurted it out like that. What those people think doesn't matter one bit. Anyone with eyes can see what a good, decent woman you are." But Rose barely heard Martha's reassurances. All she could think about was Thomas's new bride, some unknown woman from Kansas who was apparently everything Rose had failed to be. Would this woman be smaller, more delicate? Would she accept Thomas's demands without question? Would she succeed where Rose had so spectacularly failed? The bell above the bakery door chimed, and Dr. Clark entered, stamping snow from his boots. He took one look at Rose's pale face and Martha's concerned expression and immediately moved into professional mode. "What's happened here?" Martha quickly explained about Thomas's impending marriage and Rose's reaction. Dr. Clark listened with a deepening frown, then pulled up a chair to sit directly in front of Rose. "Miss Mitchell, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What Thomas Whitmore did to you was unconscionable. No decent man deceives a woman into traveling across the country only to reject her for failing to meet expectations that were never honestly communicated. His behavior reflects on his character, not yours." Rose looked into Dr. Clark's kind eyes and saw complete sincerity there. He continued speaking in the firm, authoritative tone he used when prescribing medicine. "Furthermore, the fact that he's already engaged to another woman proves that his rejection of you had nothing to do with your worthiness as a person. He's simply a man who views women as interchangeable commodities, rather than individuals deserving of respect and genuine affection." The doctor's words began to penetrate the fog of Rose's renewed despair. She had been so focused on what she might have done wrong, so convinced that Thomas's rejection was proof of her inadequacy, that she hadn't considered the possibility that the fault lay entirely with him. Martha nodded vigorously. "Dr. Clark is absolutely right. Thomas Whitmore is the one who should be ashamed, not you." Over the next few days, Rose found herself the recipient of unexpected support from throughout Cedar Falls. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who ran the town's small library, stopped by the bakery to tell Rose that she thought Thomas was a fool. Jake Morrison, the man who had driven Rose to the train station that first awful day, approached her on the street to apologize for his role in Thomas's deception, explaining that he had written the letters at Thomas's request, but hadn't understood the extent of the lies involved. Most surprisingly, several women from Samuel's congregation made a point of visiting the bakery to express their solidarity. Mrs. Rebecca Stone, whose husband owned the blacksmith shop, was particularly outspoken. "Any man who would treat a woman the way Thomas treated you isn't fit to clean our boots," she declared while purchasing her weekly bread order. "We've all been talking, and we want you to know that you're welcome at our church, regardless of what anyone else might say." These expressions of support helped heal some of the damage to Rose's confidence, but they also highlighted how much her story had become public knowledge. The thought of attending church services where everyone knew about her humiliation made her stomach churn with anxiety. It was Samuel who provided the perspective that finally allowed Rose to move beyond her embarrassment. He appeared at the bakery on Thursday evening, just as Martha was closing for the day. His usually composed demeanor seemed slightly ruffled, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested barely controlled anger. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt I needed to speak with you directly." Martha immediately invited him in and bustled about preparing tea, her movements quick and nervous. Samuel declined the refreshment and went straight to the heart of his visit. "I've heard the talk around town about Thomas Whitmore's upcoming marriage, and I want you to know that I find the speculation about your character to be both unchristian and completely unfounded." Rose felt her cheeks burn with shame, but Samuel continued before she could attempt to respond. "More importantly, I want you to understand that the congregation's invitation for you to join our musical ministry stands regardless of any gossip or judgment from those who should know better. Your worth is not determined by Thomas Whitmore's approval or disapproval, and your gifts are not diminished by his blindness to them." Samuel's words carried the weight of genuine conviction, and Rose felt something inside her chest begin to uncurl for the first time since hearing about Thomas's engagement. She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with grateful tears. "I spoke with the church board about your situation," Samuel continued. "Not the personal details, of course, but the fact that you've been the target of unkind speculation. To a man, they expressed their desire to have you feel welcome in our church family. Several of them mentioned how much they've appreciated your quiet presence at our services, even when you've remained outside." Rose's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't realized that her careful listening from the chapel doorway had been noticed, much less appreciated. Martha, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward with a determined expression. "Samuel, I think it's time Rose knew something about the people who've been criticizing her." Samuel looked questionable, but Martha continued, with the firmness of someone who had made up her mind to speak uncomfortable truths. "Most of the harsh words have come from three women who have their own reasons for jealousy. Mrs. Whitmore, Thomas's aunt, is embarrassed by her nephew's behavior and is trying to deflect blame. Mrs. Foster has been angling to match her daughter with Thomas for years and is bitter that he chose a mail-order bride over a local girl. And Mrs. Crane is just a spiteful woman who enjoys having someone to look down on." Rose absorbed this information with a mixture of relief and sadness. Knowing that her critics had personal motivations for their unkindness made their words less powerful, but it also reminded her of how quickly a small community could turn against an outsider. Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "That's actually quite helpful to know, Martha. It confirms my suspicion that the criticism comes from a very small but vocal minority rather than any widespread sentiment. He turned back to Rose with renewed intensity. Miss Mitchell, I want to make you a promise. If you choose to join our congregation formally, either as a musician or simply as a member, I will not tolerate any behavior that makes you feel unwelcome or judged. The church is meant to be a place of healing and acceptance, not condemnation and gossip. Rose felt overwhelming gratitude for Samuel's protection and support, but also a deep longing for the community and purpose he was offering. She had been adrift for so long, first in her aunt's failing dress shop and then in the aftermath of Thomas's rejection. The idea of belonging somewhere again, of having a role to play in something larger than herself, was almost too wonderful to believe. That night, Rose made a decision that would change the course of her new life in Cedar Falls. She sat at Martha's kitchen table with paper and pen, composing a letter that would require every ounce of courage she possessed. "Dear Reverend Hayes," she wrote in her careful script, "I would be honored to serve as organist for the Cedar Falls Community Chapel. While my voice remains silent, my hands are steady, and my heart is full of music that longs to find expression. If the congregation will have me, I promise to serve with dedication and gratitude. Your kindness and that of so many others in this community has shown me that God's love often comes through the hands and hearts of His people. Thank you for helping me remember who I am beneath the pain of recent disappointments." She signed the letter simply Rose Mitchell and sealed it in an envelope. Tomorrow, she would deliver it to Samuel and take the first step toward reclaiming not just her musical gifts, but her place in a community of faith. As she prepared for bed, Rose found herself humming softly under her breath. The sound was still, barely audible, more breath than tone, but it was something. For the first time since that horrible night at Thomas's ranch, she had produced something that resembled music from her own throat. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Saturday arrived grey and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest winter coats. Rose tried not to think about the wedding taking place at Thomas's ranch, tried not to imagine some other woman speaking vows that should have been hers. Instead, she focused on the letter she had delivered to Samuel the day before, and his immediate, joyful acceptance of her offer to play for the congregation. They had arranged to meet at the chapel that afternoon for Rose to practice on the old pump organ and familiarize herself with the hymns most commonly used in their services. When Rose arrived, she found Samuel waiting with a stack of sheet music and an expression of barely contained excitement. "I can't tell you how much this means to the congregation," he said as he helped her out of her heavy coat. "And to me personally, music has always been such an important part of worship, and we've felt its absence keenly." The pump organ was more responsive than Rose had expected, its tone warm and rich despite its age. Samuel worked the bellows, while Rose tested different stops and combinations, and gradually the chapel filled with melody for the first time in months. When Rose began playing "How Great Thou Art," Samuel's voice joined in, his rich baritone providing the words that Rose's damaged throat could not. The combination of organ and voice created something beautiful and complete, and Rose felt tears streaming down her cheeks as they reached the soaring chorus. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, not just the ability to make music, but the chance to make music that mattered, that lifted hearts and souls towards something greater than themselves. When the last notes faded away, Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he turned to Rose with eyes that seemed suspiciously bright. "That was extraordinary. I had forgotten how powerful music could be when it comes from a place of real faith and feeling." Rose wiped her tears and managed a trembling smile. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, she felt like herself again, not the rejected mail-order bride, not the silent woman who worked in the bakery, but Rose Mitchell, musician and servant of God. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with sunlight streaming through the chapel's stained glass windows and painting rainbow patterns on the wooden floor. Rose arrived early to warm up the organ and calm her nerves. When the congregation began filing in, she was surprised to see how many familiar faces turned toward her, with smiles of welcome and encouragement. Martha had claimed a seat in the front pew and gave Rose an enthusiastic thumbs up. Dr. Clark nodded approvingly from his usual spot near the back. Even Harold Henderson, who had returned from Denver the night before, had come to hear Rose's debut performance. Samuel took his place at the pulpit and looked directly at Rose before beginning the service. Before we begin our worship this morning, I want to introduce someone who has blessed us greatly by agreeing to provide musical accompaniment for our services. Miss Rose Mitchell has graciously offered her considerable talents to enhance our praise and worship, and I know you'll join me in expressing our gratitude for her service. The congregation burst into spontaneous applause, and Rose felt her face flush with pleasure and embarrassment. When Samuel announced the opening hymn, Rose's hands found the keys with confidence born of years of practice and renewed purpose. As the congregation's voices rose together in blessed assurance, Rose felt something shift inside her chest. Not her voice, that remained stubbornly silent, but something deeper and more fundamental. She was home. Thomas Whitmore's rejection had brought her to this moment, to this community, to this discovery that her worth was not determined by one man's approval, but by her own gifts and the service she could offer to others. The woman from Kansas was welcome to Thomas and his ranch. Rose had found something far more precious in the chapel of Cedar Falls, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. As the service continued and Rose's music supported prayer and praise, she began to understand that her journey west had not been a failure at all. It had been a redirection, a painful but necessary detour that had led her exactly where she needed to be. Winter deepened its hold on Cedar Falls as January melted into February, bringing with it a crystalline beauty that transformed the Montana landscape into something ethereal and pure. Rose had settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and purposeful, her days divided between helping Martha at the bakery and preparing music for the Sunday services that had become the highlight of her week. The old pump organ had responded to her touch like a faithful friend, its voice growing richer and more expressive under her careful attention. Samuel had arranged for the church's handyman to tune and repair the instrument, and now its song filled the chapel with warmth that seemed to seep into the very walls. Rose had expanded beyond simple hymn accompaniments, adding delicate preludes and postludes that gave the services a sense of ceremony and reverence that the congregation had never experienced before. Her repertoire grew week by week as Samuel shared his collection of sheet music, pieces that had belonged to Emily and others he had acquired from traveling ministers and visiting musicians. Rose discovered a particular affinity for the old German chorales, their complex harmonies and soaring melodies speaking to something deep in her musical soul. When she played Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring one Sunday morning, the entire congregation sat in stunned silence for several moments after the final note faded away. It was Mrs. Rebecca Stone who finally broke the spell, calling out from her pew, "Lord, have mercy, that was beautiful enough to wake the angels." The burst of appreciative murmurs and gentle applause that followed made Rose's heart swell with a joy she hadn't felt since her earliest days of singing in Springfield. She was making a difference here, using her gifts to elevate and inspire, to create moments of transcendence in the midst of ordinary frontier life. Samuel had noticed the change in her as well. After services, he would often linger at the organ bench, discussing the music and sharing observations about how different pieces affected the congregation's worship experience. These conversations had evolved from purely musical topics to deeper discussions about faith, purpose, and the mysterious ways that God worked through human creativity. One snowy Sunday evening in late February, Samuel approached Rose after she had finished playing the postlude, a gentle arrangement of Amazing Grace that she had composed herself. The congregation had dispersed into the winter twilight, their voices carrying snatches of conversation and laughter as they made their way home to warm suppers and glowing hearths. "Rose?" Samuel said, his voice carrying a note of hesitation that was unusual for him. "I wonder if I might ask you something." She looked up from the keyboard, her hands still resting on the silent keys. Over the months, Samuel had grown comfortable with her silence, often carrying on entire conversations where her nods, smiles, and expressive gestures provided all the response he needed. "I've been thinking about Easter," he continued. "It's still several weeks away, but I wanted to give you time to consider something special. I know that your voice hasn't returned yet, but I keep hoping that someday it will. If that day comes, before Easter, would you consider singing for our sunrise service?" Rose felt her throat constrict with familiar pain and longing. She touched her neck automatically, the gesture that had become second nature whenever her lost voice was mentioned. Samuel immediately looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to pressure you or remind you of something painful. It's just that I can't help feeling that your voice is still there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Sometimes healing happens gradually, and sometimes it comes all at once when we least expect it." Rose managed a shaky smile and nodded to show that she understood his faith in her eventual recovery, even if she couldn't share it. The truth was that she had almost stopped trying to sing, had grown accustomed to expressing her musical gifts through the organ alone. The silence had become a comfortable companion, protecting her from the risk of further disappointment. That night, Rose lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind whistle around Martha's small house and thinking about Samuel's Easter invitation. She tried to imagine herself standing before the congregation, her voice soaring in celebration of Christ's resurrection. But the image felt as distant and impossible as flying to the moon. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to the bakery. Rose was arranging fresh cinnamon rolls in the display case when the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see Thomas Whitmore entering with a slight, pale young woman who must be his new wife. Rose's hands trembled as she sat down. The tray, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Thomas looked exactly the same, his face hard and calculating as his eyes swept the bakery's interior. His bride was everything Rose was not. Tiny and delicate, with blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed perpetually downcast. She clung to Thomas's arm as if afraid she might blow away in the slightest breeze. "Well," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the small space like a slap, "if it isn't the infamous Rose Mitchell, still here, I see." Martha emerged from the kitchen at the sound of his voice, her expression immediately turning thunderous. "Thomas Whitmore, you have some nerve showing your face in my establishment." Thomas's laugh was cold and mirthless. "It's a free country, Martha. Besides, I wanted my wife to meet the woman who caused such a stir in our little town. Helen, this is the mail-order bride I told you about, the one who thought she was too good for honest ranch work." Rose felt every word like a physical blow, but something strange was happening inside her chest. Instead of the crushing shame she expected, she felt a growing sense of anger and indignation. This man had lied to her, manipulated her dreams, and was now attempting to humiliate her in front of his new wife and anyone else within earshot. Helen Whitmore looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Rose's with an expression that seemed more sympathetic than judgmental. In that brief glance, Rose saw something that made her stomach clench with recognition. Fear. This young woman was afraid of her husband, afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing, afraid of the same crushing rejection that Rose had experienced. Martha stepped forward, her voice deadly quiet. "Thomas, you will take your lies and your cruelty and get out of my bakery this instant. Or I will ask Dr. Clark to examine that bruise on your wife's wrist and explain to the sheriff how it got there." Thomas's face went white, then red with rage. "You have no right to interfere in my marriage, you old busybody. I have every right to protect women from men who think they can treat them like property," Martha shot back. "Now get out before I lose my temper completely." Thomas grabbed Helen's arm roughly and steered her toward the door, but not before turning back to Rose with a sneer that revealed the true depths of his character. "I hope you're happy with your pathetic little life here, Rose. Playing organ for a handful of farmers and living on charity. It's probably the best you can do." The door slammed behind them with such force that the bell continued ringing for several seconds. Martha stood in the aftermath, her hands clenched into fists and her face flushed with righteous anger. "That man is pure poison," she declared, "and that poor little thing he married. Did you see how she flinched when he touched her? I fear for what her life will be like." Rose had seen, and the knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone. Helen Whitmore was living the life that might have been Rose's fate, trapped in a marriage with a man who saw women as objects to be controlled and manipulated. The realization should have made Rose grateful for her escape, but instead it filled her with a deep sadness for the young woman who hadn't been as fortunate. That evening, Rose found herself walking through the snow to the chapel, needing the peace and solitude that the sacred space provided. She let herself in through the side door and made her way to the organ bench, her fingers finding the keys in the darkness by touch alone. Without conscious thought, she began playing one of Emily's favorite hymns, "It Is Well With My Soul." The music poured from the instrument like a prayer, filling the empty chapel with melody that spoke of faith, persevering through trials, and peace found in the midst of struggle. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice Samuel entering the chapel until he began pumping the bellows to give the organ more breath. His presence was comforting rather than intrusive, and Rose continued playing, letting the music express everything she couldn't say about the day's painful encounter. When the last note faded away, Samuel moved to sit in the front pew, his face thoughtful in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. "Martha told me what happened at the bakery today," he said quietly. "I want you to know that Thomas's words have no power unless you give them power. The life you've built here, the music you share with us, the way you've blessed this community, none of that is pathetic or small. It's beautiful and meaningful and exactly what God intended for you." Rose felt tears sliding down her cheeks, not from sadness this time, but from gratitude for Samuel's unwavering support and understanding. He had never tried to fix her or push her to heal faster than she was able. Instead, he had simply created space for her to grow and discover her own strength. "There's something else I want to tell you," Samuel continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Something I probably should have said weeks ago, but haven't had the courage to express." Rose turned on the organ bench to face him fully, her heart beginning to race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. "Since Emily died, I thought my capacity for love had died with her. I went through the motions of living, of serving my congregation, but my heart felt empty and cold. Then you came to Cedar Falls, broken and silent, and somehow your presence began to thaw something inside me that I thought was frozen forever." Samuel stood and moved closer, his eyes never leaving Rose's face. "I love the way you listen during sermons, as if every word matters. I love how you make the old organ sing like it never has before. I love your strength and resilience, the way you've rebuilt your life from nothing but determination and faith. Most of all, I love the person you are beneath the pain. Kind, generous, gifted, and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with character. Rose's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she might actually be able to speak, to tell Samuel how much his words meant to her. But only air emerged, frustrating and familiar. Samuel seemed to understand her struggle. You don't need to say anything right now. I just needed you to know how I feel, needed you to understand that you are cherished exactly as you are, voice or no voice. If your singing never returns, it won't change how I feel about you. And if it does return, well, that will just be one more blessing in a life that's already abundantly blessed by your presence. He reached out and took her hands, his touch warm and steady and completely without demand or expectation. I know it's too soon to speak of marriage, too soon to ask you to consider building a life with someone else after what you've been through. But I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would be honored to court you properly. Rose's tears were flowing freely now, but they were tears of joy and wonder rather than grief. Samuel's declaration was everything that Thomas's letters had pretended to be: honest, respectful, based on genuine knowledge of who she was, rather than some fictional ideal he had created in his mind. She squeezed his hands tightly and nodded, hoping he could see in her eyes everything she couldn't yet speak aloud. Samuel's smile was radiant in the dim light of the chapel. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." As winter gave way to spring, Rose felt herself blossoming like the wildflowers that began to dot the Montana landscape. Her relationship with Samuel deepened gradually and naturally, built on shared faith, mutual respect, and countless hours of conversation where her silence was never seen as a barrier but simply another form of communication. They took long walks through the awakening countryside, with Samuel pointing out the first green shoots of prairie grass, and Rose responding with gentle touches on his arm and expressive gestures that conveyed her delight in the changing season. They spent evenings at Martha's kitchen table, planning Easter services and discussing theology, while Martha beamed at them like a proud mother watching her children find happiness. The congregation had quickly picked up on the growing attachment between their minister and their organist, and their approval was both obvious and overwhelming. Mrs. Stone made a point of telling Rose that Samuel seemed like a different man since she'd arrived, more joyful and alive than he'd been since Emily's death. Dr. Clark observed that grief was like any other ailment. It needed time and the right medicine to heal, and love was often the most effective treatment available. As Easter approached, Rose found herself thinking more and more about Samuel's invitation to sing at the sunrise service. She had been experimenting quietly with her voice, humming softly when she was alone and trying to coax sound from her damaged throat. Progress was minimal and frustrating, but occasionally she could produce a breathy whisper of melody that gave her hope. The week before Easter, Martha made an announcement that changed everything. She had been corresponding with her sister in Denver, who had recovered from her illness and was planning to move to Cedar Falls permanently. The sister was an experienced baker who could help run the business, which meant that Martha would no longer need Rose's daily assistance. "Don't look so worried, dear," Martha said, seeing Rose's expression. "This is good news, not bad. It means you'll be free to pursue other opportunities, maybe think about getting married to a certain minister who's been mooning over you for months." Rose blushed furiously, but Martha's teasing was gentle and affectionate. The truth was that Rose had been thinking about marriage to Samuel more and more frequently, imagining a life where they could serve the community together, where her music and his ministry could combine to create something beautiful and lasting. That evening, Samuel proposed a walk to their favorite spot overlooking the valley, where the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom in scattered patches of color. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the air was soft with the promise of spring. They sat on a fallen log that had become their unofficial meeting place, watching the lights begin to twinkle in the windows of Cedar Falls. Below, Samuel had been quieter than usual during their walk, and Rose could sense that he had something important on his mind. "Rose," he finally said, his voice nervous but determined, "I know we haven't talked about the future in specific terms, but I can't wait any longer to ask you something that's been on my heart for weeks." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I love you completely and desperately, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how precious you are. Will you marry me?" The proposal was everything Rose had dreamed of, but never expected to receive. Heartfelt, respectful, based on genuine love rather than convenience or desperation. She threw her arms around Samuel's neck and nodded vigorously, tears of joy streaming down her face. Samuel held her close, his own eyes wet with emotion. "I had hoped, but I hardly dared to believe you might feel the same way. We'll have the most beautiful life together, Rose. I promise you that." As they sat together in the gathering twilight, Rose felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been frozen and silent for months, beginning to crack and warm. She opened her mouth, not expecting anything different from the usual whispered breath, but what emerged was a sound that made Samuel's arms tighten around her in wonder. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible but unmistakably clear. "Yes, Samuel, I love you too." The sound of her own voice, fragile and rusty from disuse but undeniably present, sent shockwaves through Rose's entire body. Samuel pulled back to look at her face, his expression incredulous. "Did you just, Rose, was that your voice?" Rose touched her throat in amazement, then tried again. "I think it was," she said, the words coming out stronger this time. "Oh, Samuel, I can speak again." They laughed and cried together as Rose's voice grew stronger with each attempt, rough and unpracticed, but definitely there. It was as if Samuel's love and acceptance had finally given her permission to reclaim the part of herself she had thought was lost forever. Easter morning dawned clear and bright, with a warmth in the air that promised the full arrival of spring. Rose stood beside Samuel at the front of the chapel, wearing a simple white dress that Martha had helped her sew for the occasion. The congregation had gathered before sunrise for the special service, their faces expectant and joyful in the soft light of oil lamps and candles. Samuel had announced their engagement the previous Sunday to the delight and celebration of the entire community. But this morning held an even greater surprise, one that only Samuel and Martha knew about in advance. As the service began and the eastern sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Samuel stepped forward to address the congregation. "My friends, we gather this morning to celebrate the greatest miracle in human history, Christ's victory over death and the promise of eternal life for all who believe. But this Easter morning brings us another miracle, smaller perhaps, but no less precious to those who have witnessed it." He turned to Rose with a smile that was radiant with love and pride. Miss Rose Mitchell, who has blessed us so richly with her musical gifts these past months, has found her voice again. She has asked to share that voice with us this morning in celebration of our Lord's resurrection. A murmur of excitement and anticipation rippled through the congregation as Rose moved to stand beside the organ. Her hands were shaking slightly as she found the opening chords of "Christ the Lord is risen today," but her voice, when it emerged, was clear and strong and more beautiful than anyone remembered. The melody soared through the chapel like a bird taking flight, carrying with it all the joy and hope and gratitude that Rose had stored up during her months of silence. She sang of death defeated and life triumphant, of grace sufficient for every trial and love that conquered all fear. When she reached the final triumphant Alleluia, the entire congregation joined in, their voices blending with hers in a chorus of praise that seemed to lift the very roof of the chapel toward heaven. Tears streamed down faces throughout the sanctuary as the music proclaimed the eternal truth that brokenness could be healed, that silence could give way to song, that God's love was big enough to redeem any story. As the last notes faded away and the congregation sat in awed silence, Samuel moved to stand beside Rose at the front of the chapel. The sun had risen fully now, streaming through the stained glass windows and painting everything in golden light. "My beloved friends," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can think of no better way to celebrate this Easter morning than to announce that Rose has agreed to become my wife. We would be honored if you would witness our marriage here, in this chapel where we have served together and found such joy." The congregation erupted in applause and tears and shouts of congratulation. Mrs. Stone called out, "It's about time," and Dr. Clark declared it the best Easter present the community could have received. 6 weeks later, on a perfect May morning, when the wildflowers carpeted the valley floor and the mountains stood sharp and clear against a brilliant blue sky, Rose Mitchell became Rose Hayes in the same chapel where she had found her voice and her purpose and her deepest love. She wore her mother's pearl earrings and a dress of pale blue silk that complemented her auburn hair perfectly. Martha had woven wildflowers into her hair, and her bouquet was made of prairie roses that Samuel had picked himself from their favorite hillside spot. The entire town attended the wedding, including some unexpected guests. Helen Whitmore appeared at the back of the chapel just as the ceremony began, her face still bearing the marks of recent bruises, but her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, and Rose learned later that Helen had finally found the courage to leave him and was staying with relatives in town while she considered her options. As Rose walked down the aisle toward Samuel, her voice rose in a wordless melody of joy that seemed to bless everyone present. When Samuel took her hands and spoke his vows, promising to cherish her voice and her silence equally, to support her dreams and share her burdens, Rose knew that she had found something far more precious than the false promises that had first brought her to Montana. Their marriage was a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love, exactly what those deceptive letters had promised but never could have delivered. Samuel encouraged Rose's musical gifts, and together they built a musical ministry that drew visitors from throughout the territory. Rose established a children's choir and began giving music lessons, sharing her gifts with a new generation and helping other young women find their own voices. Years later, when people asked Rose about her journey to Montana and the painful beginning of her life in Cedar Falls, she would smile and say that God had used Thomas Whitmore's cruelty to lead her to exactly where she needed to be. Her rejection had been the very thing that opened the door to her true calling and her deepest happiness. Thomas himself left Montana within a year of Rose's wedding, his reputation in tatters and his ranch failing due to his poor treatment of workers and neighbors. Helen divorced him and eventually remarried a kind widower who treated her with the gentleness she deserved. Rose and Samuel remained in Cedar Falls for the rest of their long lives, serving their community and raising 4 children who inherited their mother's musical gifts and their father's generous hearts. The chapel still stands today, though the town around it has grown and changed beyond recognition. But visitors say that on quiet Sunday mornings, when the light streams through those same stained glass windows, you can still hear the echo of Rose's voice lifting in praise and thanksgiving, a testament to the truth that broken things can be made beautiful again, and that love, real love, is always worth the wait. 25 years had passed since Rose Mitchell first stepped off that train in Cedar Falls, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a heart full of broken dreams. Now, as Rose Hayes stood in the same chapel where she had found her voice, And her love. She marveled at how completely her life had transformed from those dark winter days when silence had seemed like her permanent companion. The chapel itself had grown over the decades, expanded twice to accommodate the thriving congregation that had developed under Samuel's gentle leadership and Rose's musical ministry. The original pump organ had been replaced by a magnificent instrument donated by a wealthy rancher whose daughter Rose had taught to sing. But Rose still kept the old organ bench in their parlor at home, a reminder of where her healing had truly begun. This particular Sunday morning in May of 1912 was special beyond the usual celebration of worship. The congregation had gathered not just for regular service, but to celebrate Samuel and Rose's 24th wedding anniversary and to witness a moment that had been years in the making. Their eldest daughter, Sarah, now 22 and possessing a voice that surpassed even her mother's legendary gift, was preparing to sing her first solo as the new choir director. Rose sat in the front pew alongside Samuel, their three other children ranged beside them in order of age. David, 20, had inherited his father's calling to ministry and would be graduating from seminary in Denver next month. The twins, Elizabeth and Mary, 18 years old and inseparable since birth, had both shown remarkable musical talent, with Elizabeth playing violin like an angel and Mary mastering the piano with technical skill that amazed even their accomplished mother. As Sarah took her place at the front of the chapel, Rose's mind drifted back to the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The early years of her marriage to Samuel had been filled with the simple joys of building a life together, in a community that had embraced them both with open hearts. Their small parsonage had become a gathering place for townspeople seeking counsel, comfort, or simply the warmth of genuine friendship. Rose had discovered that her musical gifts extended far beyond performance. She had a natural ability to teach, to draw out the hidden potential in voices that their owners thought were ordinary. Her children's choir had become famous throughout Montana Territory, performing at state gatherings and church conferences. But Rose had always been most proud of the confidence and joy she helped instill in young people who had never believed they could create something beautiful. The music academy she and Samuel had established in 1895 had started in their parlor with just 3 students. Now it occupied its own building on Main Street and employed 4 teachers, serving students from across the region. Rose had personally trained dozens of young women who had gone on to careers as music teachers, church organists, and even professional performers in the great cities of the East. But perhaps her greatest source of pride was the work she had done with women who, like herself, had experienced trauma that had stolen their voices. Word had spread quietly through networks of churches and women's organizations about the gentle woman in Cedar Falls who understood the connection between emotional pain and physical silence. Over the years, Rose had welcomed more than 30 women into her home and heart, helping them find their way back to song and, more importantly, to themselves. Eleanor Morrison had been one of the first. She had arrived on the train in 1890, a young widow whose husband's death in a mining accident had left her unable to speak above a whisper. Rose had recognized the signs immediately and had taken Helena under her wing, teaching her to play piano while her voice slowly healed. Helena had eventually married Dr. Clark's son and now ran the town's small library, but she still credited Rose with saving her life. Then there had been Catherine Wells, a former opera singer from Chicago whose career had been destroyed by a theater manager's brutal assault. Catherine had lived with Rose and Samuel for 6 months, slowly rebuilding not just her voice, but her faith in humanity. She had eventually returned to performing, but now used her gifts exclusively in churches and charitable venues, finding deeper satisfaction in lifting spirits than in earning applause. Most recently, Rose had been working with a young Cheyenne woman named Dancing Bear, whose traditional name was rarely used in town. She had been silenced by the trauma of forced attendance at a government boarding school, where speaking her native language had been forbidden and harshly punished. Rose had been learning basic Cheyenne phrases while helping Dancing Bear reclaim her ability to express herself in any language. The breakthrough had come just last month, when Dancing Bear had sung a traditional healing song at a private gathering in Rose's parlor. Her voice strong and proud as she honored her ancestors' memory. Samuel's gentle touch on her hand brought Rose back to the present moment. Sarah had finished her vocal warm-up and was now standing beside the new organ, her posture confident and her eyes bright with anticipation. The congregation had settled into expectant silence, aware that they were about to witness something special. Samuel rose from his seat and moved to the pulpit, his silver hair catching the morning light that streamed through the stained glass windows that had been added to commemorate his and Rose's 10th anniversary. At 57, he remained tall and straight, his gentle brown eyes unchanged by the passage of years, except for the deepening of laugh lines that spoke of a life filled with joy and laughter. "My dear friends," Samuel began, his voice carrying easily through the expanded sanctuary, "this morning marks not just another Sunday in our shared journey of faith, but a moment of particular significance for the Hayes family and for our congregation as a whole." He paused to smile at Rose, his expression full of the same love and admiration that had lit his face on their wedding day. 24 years ago, my beloved wife Rose found her voice again in this very chapel on Easter morning after months of silence that had followed great heartbreak and disappointment. Today, we celebrate the continuation of that miracle as our daughter Sarah officially takes on the role of choir director, ensuring that the musical ministry that has blessed us all these years will continue into the future. The congregation murmured with appreciation and anticipation. Many of them had watched Sarah grow up, had heard her humming along to her mother's playing from the time she could walk. They had witnessed her voice mature from a sweet child soprano to the rich, powerful instrument she now possessed. Samuel's expression grew more serious as he continued. "But before Sarah shares her gift with us this morning, I want to speak briefly about the nature of redemption and the mysterious ways that God can transform our deepest pain into our greatest purpose." Rose felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that Samuel was about to tell their story to the congregation, something he had never done in such a public way before. Over the years, pieces of her history had become known to various members of the community, but Samuel had always protected her privacy, allowing her to share her past only when and how she chose. "Many of you know that Rose came to Cedar Falls under difficult circumstances," Samuel continued. "What you may not know is that her journey here began with deception and rejection that nearly destroyed her faith in herself and in the possibility of genuine love. A man who shall remain nameless lured her here with false promises, then cast her aside when she failed to meet his unrealistic and undisclosed expectations." A protective murmur ran through the congregation. Thomas Whitmore's name was rarely spoken in Cedar Falls anymore, but his legacy of cruelty was still remembered by the older residents. That rejection, devastating as it was at the time, proved to be the very thing that brought Rose to us and us to Rose. Had she been accepted by that unworthy man, our community would have been deprived of 25 years of musical beauty, spiritual guidance, and the countless lives that have been touched and transformed by her gift and her ministry. Samuel's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as he reached the heart of his message. This is the mystery of divine providence. Friends, what appears to be disaster in the moment can become the foundation for blessings we never could have imagined. The door that slams shut in our face may be clearing the path to an open window that leads to everything we were truly meant to have. Rose was crying openly now, not from sadness, but from gratitude for a life that had turned out to be more beautiful and meaningful than any of her girlish dreams could have encompassed. The scared, silent woman who had huddled in Martha's spare room all those years ago could never have imagined the full, rich life that had grown from the ashes of her original plans. So today, Samuel concluded, as we celebrate not just an anniversary, but the continuation of a legacy, I want you to remember Rose's story whenever you face your own moments of rejection and disappointment. Trust that God sees the bigger picture, even when we cannot. Trust that your current pain may be the very thing that leads you to your true purpose. Sarah stepped forward as Samuel returned to his seat, her bearing proud and confident as she took her place at the front of the sanctuary. She had chosen to sing "How Great Thou Art," the same hymn that Rose had played on her very first visit to the chapel, but arranged as a solo with orchestral accompaniment provided by her siblings and several other young musicians Rose had trained. Over the years, when Sarah's voice filled the chapel, pure and powerful and full of worship, Rose felt as if her heart might burst with pride and gratitude. This was her legacy, not just in her daughter's voice, but in all the voices she had helped heal and strengthen over the years. Every note that rang out in churches and concert halls and family parlors throughout the territory carried a piece of her influence, a ripple effect of beauty that would continue long after she was gone. The congregation joined Sarah for the final verse, their voices blending in harmony that spoke of years of musical education and spiritual growth under Rose's guidance. As the last notes faded away, the silence that followed was not empty, but full, pregnant with the presence of the divine that had been summoned by their collective offering of praise. After the service, the congregation gathered in the fellowship hall for a celebration that had been weeks in the planning. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes prepared by every family in the church, and children ran between the adults while the older folks settled into chairs to share stories and laughter. Rose found herself surrounded by former students, women she had helped find their voices, and community members whose lives had been touched by her ministry in some way. Each person had a story to share, a memory of how her music or her teaching or simply her presence had made a difference during difficult times. Mrs. Rebecca Stone, now in her 70s but still spry and opinionated, approached Rose with tears in her eyes. "You know, Rose, I was thinking during the service about that first Sunday you played for us. Do you remember? You were so nervous, and we were all holding our breath, hoping the music would help us worship better." Rose smiled at the memory. "I remember thinking I might faint from fear. The organ seemed so loud, and I was sure everyone could hear my mistakes." "Mistakes?" Mrs. Stone laughed. "Child, that was the most beautiful music we'd ever heard in that chapel. And every Sunday since then, you've given us a piece of heaven to take home with us." Similar conversations continued throughout the afternoon, each one a reminder of the web of connection and influence that Rose had woven through her years in Cedar Falls. She had touched lives not just through her music, but through her kindness, her resilience, and her unwavering faith that broken things could be made whole again. As the afternoon wore on, Rose noticed a familiar figure standing uncertainly near the entrance to the fellowship hall. Helen Morrison, Thomas Whitmore's former wife, had been living in Denver for the past 15 years, but occasionally visited Cedar Falls to see friends and attend special church events. She had remarried a gentle accountant named James Morrison and had found happiness and peace in her second marriage. But Rose knew that the scars from her first marriage still occasionally troubled her. Rose excused herself from her current conversation and made her way through the crowd to greet Helen, whose face lit up with genuine joy at Rose's approach. Rose, I wasn't sure if I should come today, but James insisted that I needed to be here for such a special celebration. I'm so glad you came, Rose said warmly, embracing the smaller woman. It means the world to me to have you here. Helen's eyes filled with tears. I've been thinking all morning about how different both our lives might have been if things had gone the way Thomas planned. You saved me, you know, by refusing to accept what he offered. If you hadn't shown me that it was possible to walk away from a bad situation, I might never have found the courage to leave. Rose shook her head gently. You saved yourself, Helen. I just happened to be an example of what was possible. The strength was already inside you. Perhaps, Helen said, but seeing you build such a beautiful life here, watching you find real love with Samuel, knowing that you had faced the same rejection and confusion I was experiencing, it gave me hope that there might be something better waiting for me too. They talked for several more minutes, sharing updates about their families and their lives. Helen's children from her second marriage were thriving, and she had become involved in charitable work, helping other women escape difficult situations. Before she left, she pressed a small package into Rose's hands. This is for you, Helen said. I wanted you to have something that represents how much your example has meant to me over the years. Rose unwrapped the package to find a delicate silver locket inscribed with the words, "Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come." Inside was a tiny photograph of Helen's family and a pressed wildflower from the hillside where Rose and Samuel had been married. Helen, this is beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like, Helen replied. I'll never forget that you chose to stay and build something beautiful rather than running back to what was familiar. As the celebration began to wind down and families started to gather their children and their belongings, Rose found herself standing with Samuel in the doorway of the fellowship hall, watching their community with deep contentment. Their 4 children were helping with cleanup, their voices blending in harmony as they sang while they worked, unconsciously creating music even in the midst of mundane tasks. Samuel slipped his arm around Rose's waist and pulled her close. Are you happy, my love? Has this day been everything you hoped it would be? Rose leaned into her husband's warmth and considered the question seriously. The day had been wonderful. But more than that, it had been a perfect representation of the life they had built together, full of music and faith and community, rooted in service to others and grounded in love that had only grown deeper with time. I'm more than happy, she said finally. I'm grateful beyond words for every twist and turn that brought us to this moment, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. Without them, we might never have found each other. Samuel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Thomas had kept his promises? If you had married him and stayed on that ranch? Rose was quiet for a moment, imagining the alternate life that might have been hers. Sometimes, she admitted. But I can't imagine that version of me would have been truly happy. I would have spent my life trying to be someone I wasn't. Suppressing the parts of myself that didn't fit his vision of what a wife should be. I might have had security, but I wouldn't have had purpose or genuine love or the joy that comes from using your gifts to serve others. She turned in Samuel's arms to face him directly. Besides, that other life wouldn't have had you in it, and a life without you seems impossible to imagine now. Samuel's smile was tender and full of the same wonder that had filled his face. On their wedding day, I love you, Rose Hayes. I loved you when you couldn't speak above a whisper, and I love you now when your voice can fill a cathedral. I loved you when you thought you were broken beyond repair, and I love you now when you help heal others. My love for you has never depended on what you could give me, only on who you are. As they walked home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, their children's laughter echoing behind them and the chapel bells ringing the hour, Rose reflected on the strange and wonderful ways that life could surprise you. She had come to Montana as a desperate woman seeking escape from financial hardship and limited options. She was leaving this anniversary celebration as a beloved wife, devoted mother, respected teacher, and pillar of her community. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken years of small choices, daily acts of faith, and the gradual accumulation of confidence that comes from being consistently loved and valued. But the foundation for everything good in her life had been laid during those dark winter months when she'd been forced to discover who she truly was beneath the roles and expectations that others had tried to impose on her. That evening, as Rose sat at her piano playing softly while Samuel read in his favorite chair and their children pursued their own evening activities, she found herself humming the melody that had returned to her on Easter morning all those years ago. Her voice was richer now, seasoned by years of joy and sorrow, triumph and disappointment, but still capable of creating beauty that touched hearts and lifted spirits. Sarah appeared in the doorway, drawn by the familiar tune. Without speaking, she added her own voice to her mother's, creating a harmony that seemed to fill the house with warmth and peace. One by one, the other children joined them, each adding their own part to the impromptu family concert. As their voices blended in the gathering twilight, Rose thought about all the women who had sat in this same parlor over the years, learning to trust their voices again after trauma had stolen them away. She thought about the students who had discovered their own musical gifts under her patient guidance. She thought about the congregation that had welcomed a broken stranger and helped her heal through the simple act of allowing her to serve. Most of all, she thought about the young woman who had stood on a train platform 25 years ago, silent and terrified and convinced that her life was over. That woman could never have imagined the symphony of love and purpose that would grow from the ashes of her shattered dreams. The music swelled around her, her family's voices creating something beautiful and whole and eternal. This was her legacy, Rose realized. Not just the songs she had sung or the students she had taught, but the living proof that broken things could be made beautiful again, that rejection could lead to redemption, and that the deepest love often came disguised as the greatest disappointment. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky, the same stars that had watched over her during those first lonely nights in Cedar Falls. But now they looked down on a woman who had found her place in the world, who had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the gift of becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.